Okay.
So I'm Roland Cooper. I'm a regional sales manager for Banner Solutions in the Northeast. And Banner Solutions is a distributor of door hardware and access control solutions. Our customers are the resellers and installers of these products and solutions to schools, places of worship, and other public institutions. And so we're interested in talking with you this morning, Elisa, because as you can imagine, we've seen an increase in the number of calls from our customers looking for solutions to secure and lock down facilities in the event of an active shooter threat. And our customers are also challenged with finding funding for these solutions.
Well, I'm glad you guys connected with me, and I definitely can talk a lot about security grants. I've been doing this for about, I think, almost 12 years, 13 years. When I first started working with grants, I was doing my master's at John Jay, and they had a phenomenal program through CUNY Research. So CUNY Research had a program where they would take all of the graduate students. A lot of them were law enforcement, military, and then just some general security consultants, and train them on how to do very specific types of assessments for customers who were applying for security grants. And as you can imagine, year after year, the funding for those grants have increased. In fact, one of the grants we're going to talk about today, which is the NSGP, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, it's a federal grant program, that in just the last year has increased about $70 million. And with some of the other recent events that have happened, they're injecting more funding into several of these programs. So, so that's where I got started. Ever since I did that work for CUNY Research, I've gotten contracted year after year to help a lot of the clients that are applying. And then just in the last few years, really starting with COVID, I had to morph my practice in that I couldn't necessarily get into a lot of the buildings. So we turned our program into a little bit of a virtual program. I still do on-site assessments, but for the folks that maybe are out of state or can't pay for us to physically come on site, we do have a lower cost option where we will coach them through doing their own assessment. We'll check their work, and we will help, help them apply for whichever grant program they're going for. And it's been growing, and it's been fairly successful. We've helped a lot of people get money over the years, and it's sad that we need this program, but I like working with schools and synagogues, churches, hospitals. You know, it's good work.
Good. And just to introduce myself, my name is Travis Howell, and I'm one of the marketing managers here at Banner Solutions. And, you know, typically we as a wholesale supplier of security hardware, our conversations, whether it's on the marketing side or in talking directly with our customers, it's about products. And that's usually what we talk about. But today in this conversation, we're taking a few steps back in the process, and we're not going to be talking about products. We're going to be talking about funding. And it's an area that, you know, we at Banner Solutions are not generally part of that conversation. And so we're not experts in that area. So, which is why it was great to connect with you, Elisa, and be able to bring you into this conversation. Because we do know that many of our customers, the security dealers and installers, they are working closely with the local schools and other facilities. And so they can be a source of information for regarding funding.
Well, and just before we started the conversation this morning, I mentioned that, you know, your team can provide a valuable resource in terms of how much certain items cost. So as an example, when we're applying for the grant, particularly the NSGP grant, you have to put in a request for how much funding you want for each category. And there are many different categories. You can apply for funds to, you know, increase your camera count, to harden your windows so you can get glass film, or you can, of course, request funding for doors and locks, but you have to give them some sort of budgetary number. Now, you're not married to that number, but it's a challenging thing for someone who doesn't do this type of installation every day to budget that kind of number. So for you, providing the resources, the cost estimates to clients that I work with, that's really, really helpful.
I guess as a starting point, what type of funding is available out there?
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot of funding out there, and there's different types of funding. Right now, we're really just going to focus, just for today's conversation, we're going to focus on the security specific grants, but I also have a team of folks that are all things grants. They look at databases of different types of grants that are out there, combing through and seeing what grants will allow you to spend money on security related items, whether it's training, glass film, locks, whatever. But these are the ones that I focus on the most. The NSGP, which is probably one of the most popular over the last decade or so. I would say probably 90–95% of the people I work with are going after the nonprofit security grant program. That's the federal program. In fiscal year 22, they gave away just over $250 million. And then the COPS grant is sort of right behind it. That's the Stop School Violence program. And that in fiscal year 22, they gave away about $53 million. Now, the differences between the two, the COPS grant might be smaller, but the per dollar value per grant is definitely higher. So COPS gave away about $500,000 per grant award, whereas the NSGP gave up to 150. However, it's 150 per building. So the next question that I get from a lot of my clients is, well, I have a campus of 3 or 4 buildings. Can I apply for 150 for each building? You can. If it is a separate physical address, you can apply. You could send in 4 separate grants each year, and you can apply year after year. So, and I have a lot of customers that apply year after year and often win. So it really, it's a very competitive process, the NSGP, but if you know what you're doing and you know how to properly do your assessment and to fill out what's called the investment justification, which is essentially the application, that's going to put you in the best position to win one of these grants. And then there's state and local grants. And I have some resources that I can share with you guys for any of your customers that are interested. And it's a state-by-state list with links for those specific state agencies that you can reach out to find out what local grants or state grants are available. Here in the Northeast, over the last decade, I've worked on a few New York City hate crime grants, and those are a little bit smaller. They're roughly around $50,000 to $75,000. And each state is different. They're going to have different guidelines and dollar values for their grants. So you really have to look at it, on a state-by-state level. But for the purposes of today's conversation, I'm going to keep referencing that NSGP because it is one of the more popular ones, and they have, if you go on the FEMA website, it's very robust. They have a ton of information. You can literally spend all day and just learn about what the grant will pay for, how to apply, how to help yourself if you can't afford an assessment, if you can't hire a security consultant. They do have a little bit of a DIY assessment tool. So, we'll keep referring back to this. Just some current events. In the last few months, and perhaps Uvalde was the impetus for some of this, but in the last few months, we've seen 2 really interesting things happen. First, the Luke and Alex School Safety Act was passed. And if anyone's interested, you can look it up. It's S111. And part of that bill stipulated that the government is going to push more funds for grant programs like the COPS grant. And please don't quote me, but I believe they stated something like $300 million would be going for grant funding. And then also recently, in the last month or so, the American Rescue Plan, well, the Biden administration had made a recommendation that they're going to encourage people to use this fund or these funds for public safety efforts. In fact, I believe they stated $10 billion of American Rescue Plan money would be going towards public safety efforts. So you're starting to see more and more attention, and this happens over time. If you look at starting from Columbine, you know, everyone started paying attention to school shootings and gun control and stuff like that. Even though Columbine, they were also making bombs in their homes. But you start seeing more attention to these different topics, and all of a sudden, you know, everyone's making school safety a priority, and then things calm down a little bit and it sort of wanes. What I hear from a lot of dealers, manufacturers, and even clients is, well, we want to increase our security presence, but we don't have the funds. You know, the budget is hurting. So things sort of wane, drop back down, and then another shooting happens and it goes back up. So it's a little bit of a roller coaster. However, we're also seeing some organizations like Zero Now and a few other nonprofits that are trying to keep the focus on what are we doing to harden the facilities? How are we protecting kids? How are we protecting, you know, our houses of worship? And let's keep a focus on this so we don't have that sort of roller coaster effect. And I'm hoping that people really sort of keep this up, and year after year they're applying for grant funding if they don't have the security budget. So when I speak to people about, are you applying for grants and do you know anything about grants? Often they say, well, you know, we don't have even the funding to hire somebody to help us. And when you look at it from the full spectrum of what you have to do, it is a lot of work. But the upfront investment, again, to work with somebody like me virtually, who's been doing these assessments for more than a decade, it's a very low investment. You know, for a virtual consulting project for assessments, we only charge $1,500. So, and with that one single assessment, you can win over $300,000 in funding if you're going after the NSGP, depending on how many buildings you have. You can also use that assessment for, you know, a state or local grant program and win even more money in that same year. So in a way, it's, you know, can you afford not to do this? And if you can't hire someone to help you, again, there's so many tools online. You can do your own assessment. There's a lot of resources available. So it really comes down to, can you afford not to? When I do talk to people about assessments, I try to remind them that, you know, even if you're hiring someone else to do the assessment, if they're law enforcement, military, I've seen a lot of really good quality assessments, but to use an assessment with your application, you really, it's up to you. You're ultimately the person responsible for your application, how you're going to spend that money. You want to make sure that the assessment that you get is mirroring the money that you're asking for. And I'll give you an example. I've worked with a couple of schools where, you know, the person who did the assessment, they were correct. They were accurate in saying, you know, you have an abundance of glass here and you really have to focus on glass film, you know, bomb resistant, blast resistant glass film. But they didn't really mention anything about the locks or the cameras. And when the person who was applying for the actual grant, when they filled out their application, all they asked for was money for locks and cameras. You know, they didn't say anything about the glass. So if those two documents are really not in line, it's going to be a little bit of a red flag for the grant reviewer who's evaluating. And again, this is a competitive process. So you have to, you know, show them that you know what you're working on, you know what your needs are, and your request is in line with those needs. So I caution everybody to really review the assessments that they get, even if a professional does it. I have all of my clients look at my assessments when I do them for, you know, on behalf of their organization, and I make sure that everything is correct. And then, you know, the process of the application, it's a little bit of a hurdle, it's a little bit of work, but then, you know, you're waiting for several months to find out if you actually got the grant award. And people think, well, okay, I got through the tough part. I got through the application. The rest we'll find out once we get the letter that we received the grant funding. Well, that's actually when the really hard work begins, because you have a certain amount of time. And it sounds like it's a lot of time. It's, typically, at least for the NSGP, it's roughly around 3 years. So it sounds like it's a lot of time, but the amount of people that have to put in requests for extensions to spend the money can be overwhelming, because they don't know the process. They don't know all the steps that you need to go through, all the documentation. You have to keep everything organized and keep communicating with your grant representative to make sure you get those reimbursements. So I tell people all the time, like, that's really when the hard part begins. And even the federal government recognizes that that's the tough part, and keeping all of that information organized. So they've allotted a certain amount of funding in each grant award, if you request it, for the management and administration of your grant fund. So in other words, they recognize how tough it is to work with them, and they're allowing you to spend part of those funds on somebody who's dedicated to keeping the program on track, the project on track, making sure that all of your documentation is in order, and you're getting those reimbursements and working with your representatives so that you can spend the money and not forfeit it, asking for extension after extension. So
who typically manages that within the customer or at the customer level?
So that's a good question. It really kind of depends on you. If you as the applicant, you can decide, well, I can manage this process, and I'm going to fill out my own application, and I'll hire somebody to do the assessment. So if you put your name down in the application and you say, I'm going to be the point person for my organization to connect with my grant representative, then the onus is on you. You can hire somebody. Again, this is part of our services when we work with clients, is that we sort of help and coach them through each step that they have to go through. But ultimately, they can add our name as their security consultant, but they also have to put themselves, because they are a member of their organization and they're going to be the ones responsible. But it's really up to each individual person. I've worked with some very large organizations that have an entire grant team. People who are just focused, they're hired and focused on finding grants for their organization. And while they never even heard of the NSGP grant, they were grateful that I could help them through the process of the application. But then they said, you know what, we have a whole team dedicated to, making sure we're in line with all of our grant spending, so we'll take it from here. So it really depends on the organization. Some people need the help. Some people, are well-versed in the whole grant world and they can do it themselves. All right, let me just.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so again, just to use NSGP as an example, because they have a ton of information online. And I would recommend everyone go onto the FEMA website and start looking through some of this information, even if you're not going after the NSGP. If you're going after the COPS grant or your state and local grant, there's so much really good quality information on here, and it's very helpful. So for anyone who does want to do that, this is the link, and I'll send you a list of some of these links as well. But this is the link to go on. One of the main things I talk to everybody about before they embark on this journey is, what's your goal? Do you have an idea of what you want to spend money on? Quite often they do. They say, oh, I saw this great new technology and I think it would be really helpful and I want to implement it in my school. I always caution them to make sure you can actually spend the funds on that product. Now, in some cases, it's not on the approved list for that grant, but if they have budget money and they want to buy it, well, now they don't have to use that budget money for other things like doors and locks and cameras if they go after the grant funding. So they can shift money around by applying for a grant like this. And then if they have items that they want to purchase that might not fall under the grant program, well, they can use their budget money for that. But what I do sort of caution everybody to do, and sometimes I get calls from manufacturers as well, like, oh, I didn't realize there was grant funding that could pay for my new widget, you know, I'm gonna send my clients to you. I always tell them, go onto the FEMA website. If you're applying for the NSGP grant, go on the FEMA website. There's and you can just look this up in their search bar, the authorized equipment list or the AEL list. And that's going to break down each grant and what is allowable to purchase in each of those grants. I will also caution you to not just utilize this this search tool, because in the last 2 years, you know, they've added new items to the authorized equipment list that haven't yet been updated on the website. So go on, try and find your category or your code for whatever it is you want to purchase. Capture the code, there's a code number, and then email FEMA, and I can share that email address with you as well, just to make sure that the item you want to purchase is in fact allowable through this grant program. And then you can proceed accordingly. You can decide, okay, well, I'm going to go after this grant or I'm not going to. But you want to check first before you invest the time, the money, the effort into doing this, because it is an arduous process.
What about the items that have been added and don't appear on the website? Would you simply email FEMA?
Yes, I always would email FEMA, even if you find your code, because the codes, when you look them up, they give you like a very brief description of what that code is for. So some of them simply say, you know, video surveillance, or you know, I think some of them even say like software for video surveillance. It doesn't tell you a lot. So you want to make sure that that code you can use when applying for funds for this particular product, and then you want to send them the product saying, does this match up? So I always recommend reaching out to them regardless whether you find your code or you don't. So again, just as an example for the NSGP, in terms of the process, what you have to go through, they broke it down into 4 different categories. But when you're on this website, even before you go through those 4 steps through the process, definitely take a look at some of the other resources. So they have a how to apply step-by-step, which is really helpful. That's those 4 categories. But they also have a preparedness manual. They have that self-assessment tool. These are all the things that you can sort of start working on leading up to the date of your grant opening. And you do have time right now. I know a lot of schools are sort of in vacation mode because we're in the summer, but there's so much work to be done. I always tell everybody just start now, because by the time they open that grant window, there's so much to prepare, and you don't want to be squeezing it all into like a week to try and get your submittal in. So start collecting all this information now and start speaking to some of these folks right now.
For the NSGP, is the grant window the same every year?
It's in the same time frame, so it's typically in Q1. Almost every year I've worked on it, it's always been like roughly around April is the due date. But and there's a process. So the notice of funding comes out and they'll tell you how much money they're giving out and any other guidelines that they want to share. That's usually like February-ish. And then you have a period of time to start preparing, and then the window opens where you can actually submit your application. And that's the application window. Usually the deadline is in April. However, this year it was a little bit delayed. And because of those delays, some states had a very small window. So the state of New Jersey, I think, had 7 days to get all their information together and submit, that was tough. And I had a couple of clients in the New Jersey area, we were scrambling. And those deadlines are actually set by the states. So for the NSGP, this is a federal program, it's federal money, but the money gets trickled down into the states, where the states are collecting all of the information from all the applicants, and then they push it back up for, you know, the final review process. So it's different state by state. If you have a friend who's, you know, in Iowa and you're in New York, and you ask them what the deadline is, you have to check for your state, because you could miss it. You got to be really careful with that. Okay, so the breakdown of the process for the NSGP, and this is good information for anyone, even if you're not going after the NSGP grant. But the first thing they advise you to do is to connect with your state reps, and we'll talk about that. I'll share the link to connect with your state reps as well. And then get all of your identifying numbers together. And this was a little bit tricky this year, fiscal year 22, they actually changed the numbers that you needed to include on your application, but we'll talk about that as well. And then the sub-materials. So because NSGP is really competitive, they do require several documents in order to apply. Some of the state and local grants are a little bit less competitive, less stringent on what you have to produce with your application. But you want to know, depending on what grant you're going after, you want to know exactly what documents you're going to need to provide with your application. So you have to do that ahead of time. For the NSGP, it's the same across all states. We'll talk about that. And then the submittal process, again, you have to know when your deadline is and make sure all of your documentation is ready to go to submit. So let's just dig into the state agency real quick. Again, on the FEMA website, you can just type in the search bar SAA list, and it's going to give you a drop down state by state of who your representative is. And again, this is something you can do right now. Don't wait until next year or right before the grant window opens. Connect with your rep now. Just get on their radar and say, I am preparing to apply for fiscal year 23's NSGP grants. And please put me on your list. Please send me, invitations to webinars. I will say FEMA does some phenomenal webinars with a ton of information where you can, not only speak to FEMA reps, but other people that are applying for the grant, people who have been doing this for a long time. I attend those webinars quite often. So I encourage everyone to at least jump on one webinar before, the grant window opens. And so just to get on your state reps radar so they can share any information with you and they know that you're going to expect an application from your organization, you can do that right now. All right. The next item that they had on that list was the UEI number. So for anyone watching, you may be familiar with what's known as a DUNS number or a Dun and Bradstreet number. Believe it or not, I had several applicants this year that didn't even hear of a DUNS number before. They didn't know what it was. I do often, redirect them to their accounting department. I say, do a little bit of research. You must have a DUNS number in order to apply. This year, they switched from the DUNS number to what's called a unique entity identifier. And if you did not have that, if you didn't know that your DUNS number got switched over to this UEI number, you had to go find it. And they did give a lot of instruction on how to do that, which was essentially just go to the sam.gov website and fill in, the step-by-step to get your DUNS number. But because everyone rushed in at the last minute, I think sam.gov got overwhelmed and couldn't get those UEI numbers processed quickly. So this year, they actually made an exception. They allowed you to apply with your old DUNS number, but they told you if you win a grant, you will not be able to use that grant until you produce your UEI. So moving forward, I'm pretty sure you're going to need to have your UEI number ready to go for the application process. So again, because they're a little bit slow and there's a lot of back and forth, I really encourage everyone to find out what their UEI number is early. And this is for, UEI is not just for the grants, it's for a lot of things. I mean, if you know how the DUNS numbers work, it's essentially going to be the same thing, I believe. I think you're going to need that UEI for a number of different things in your organization. Okay, so the prep materials or the sub-application materials. Every grant is different. For the NSGP, there are 3 documents that you need, you have to have in order to apply. First is your mission statement, and they want you to put it on letterhead, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. People think, oh, I can do that's easy, I already have a mission statement, but I would suggest that they look at it again and just revisit it. And then the assessment, and again, I can't stress this enough, make sure you review your assessment. Don't just accept the assessment from your security person or whoever is doing it for you. You really need to review it, make sure it's accurate, and make sure it reflects what you're asking for in your grant. And then the last thing is the investment justification. The investment justification is essentially the application. They're asking you about your organization, what you're going to use the money for, how much you're asking for, and how it's going to impact your organization. So again, the questions in the investment justification really have to be backed up by the assessment. I cannot stress that enough. If you've done that work properly and you reviewed both and both of them sort of mirror each other, you're putting yourself in the best position to win a grant award. And that's, that's sort of how we started this process back when I was at CUNY. And that's why we were so successful with helping people. I think I made the point for the assessments. So the mission statement, a lot of people think that, our mission statement is reflective of who we are as an organization. I've seen some mission statements that are a page long and some that are a sentence long. And, the short ones they say something like, well, we serve the students in our community and help them thrive, and that's it. That's pretty generic. In the investment justification, they're asking questions about the symbolic value of your organization or your facility. Does it have any kind of national or historic value as an institution? Or if you're associated with a religious organization, what are the values of that, of your belief system, and what does that mean to the community? So a lot of mission statements will really accurately reflect that. And if you have a fairly robust mission statement that reflects those values or the historic value of your institution or whatever it is, that's going to, again, sort of position you to be a really solid candidate for one of these grants. So when I see a mission statement on letterhead that's like 2 sentences long and does not address the value of your organization to the larger community or anything like that, I do advise people, you might want to just add a little bit of detail here, because through the whole process, the mission statement, the investment justification, the assessment, you are building your case for why they should be giving you this money, that you might be a higher target for terrorist activity because of our religious beliefs or because of the community that we serve. And the mission statement lends to that. So, I'm not telling anyone to embellish ever or flat out lie, but you want to paint the picture of why your organization is important to the community, why they might, attract negative activity.
Sure.
So in the investment justification, they break it down into several points, right? So I'm just going to move forward in the slides. These are the 7 sections of the investment justification, or at least the one that they use for fiscal year 22. Now, they've been using pretty much the same sort of format of questioning for the last, I would say, decade. And they've tweaked it a little bit in the last year. They actually have a new form, which I think everyone was sort of on pins and needles waiting to find out, because we were all trying to prepare and get our answers ready for when the grant window opened. But they, of course, didn't release the new investment justification document until the grant window opened. So, but it's fairly similar to, in terms of the questioning, to what they had previously. And even if you look at the COPS grant versus the NSGP versus some of the state and local grants, a lot of the questions, they're really honing in on the security related issues. So they're not all that much different. So in the first section, they will ask you about your organization and the physical address of the building that you are going to use these funds for. So again, if you have a campus and you have 5 buildings, you can apply 5 different times, but it's per physical address. So if you have a building and it's the same address, or the buildings are connected in some way, you definitely want to speak to your state agency to confirm if you can submit 2 different applications or it has to be under one. But it's typically per physical address. So that's what they're going to ask you in that first part. And then they're also going to ask you to elaborate on your mission statement. So now you have a little bit of extra room here to speak to the mission statement, because they ask for a mission statement summary. So you can add your mission statement, but if there's extra room, you can, of course, add a little bit more detail to that. In each of the questions on the IJ, this is something that often catches people by surprise. There is a character limit for each one of the questions. So when we start preparing to answer the IJ and we know what they're already going to ask, we start building our answers, again, we want to make sure the IJ is reflective of what we're including in the assessment. So we start building out those answers. We have to make sure that it's going to fit within the character limit that they provide for us. I'm not even going to bother telling you what those character limits are now, because we want to make sure that it's going to be the same thing in fiscal year 23. But so you're answering these questions as well as you possibly can within the guidelines that they give you.
Sure.
And then, of course, they want to confirm that you are, in fact, for the NSGP grant, they want to, of course, confirm that you are, in fact, a 501c3, any affiliations for your organization, the organization type. Are you a religious institution? Are you a higher ed institution? So that's, that's that first part of the investment justification. The background section for the IJ is where, again, they're going to ask you, what is the symbolic value of your organization, of your institution, of the building? So you have a little bit more room to elaborate on that. And that's, again, just building your case as to why you might be more of a target for terrorist activity, or why it would really impact the community if there was some sort of attack on your facility.
Mm-hmm.
Under the risk section, which is section 3, now we're really starting to dig into the security related issues. They're going to ask you about threat and vulnerability, which, again, this is the area that your threat assessment really has to line up accurately. If your threat assessment is talking all about doors and windows, and you're answering questions in the IJ about cameras and training, it might be a little bit difficult for them to approve you for this grant. The other item that they ask in the risk section is about consequences. So they want you to paint a picture that if you don't get this funding and you don't make these adjustments to your facility, how could this impact your community, your students, the larger community that you're serving? So again, you're just building that case why you really need the funding. Under facility hardening, and I'm going to just step aside here from the investment justification. We're hearing so much stuff about everything that happened at Uvalde, some of the other active shooters, whether it's the top shooter or the recent shooting in the mall. And everyone, it's getting overly politicized. And I really try and stay away from the political commentary. But for years, I just want to point this out because this is really important. For years, at least ever since Columbine, every security professional has talked about facility hardening as a means to protect the occupants of the building. And we already know what a lot of that means, as you guys, I'm sure, can give, hours and hours worth of valuable information around door hardening and locks and preparing, making sure the infrastructure is right so that somebody can't just bust through a door. So we've known this for a long time, and that's what they're basing a lot of the information on, is facility hardening. We're not really looking at guns or anything else. They have introduced training and, how to protect yourself and deploy training, whether it's active shooter, active threat, bomb threats. They're allowing you to sort of explore different ideas in different areas. But when it really comes down to it, they want to know how you're going to harden your actual facility. So when we're answering the IJ, they're asking questions such as, describe the purpose, project, and activities that will harden or make your building more safe and secure. And how that is addressing some of the vulnerabilities in your assessment. So they're really sort of putting you on the spot to look back at your assessment and make sure that you know what you're asking for, what you need to do to help yourself here. And this, they allow you to, they give you the most amount of room to sort of answer this question. And you can break it up. If you're asking for 5 different categories, cameras, windows, glass film, training, maybe you're asking for, the management administration, you have all of these categories that you can now describe and explain how everything that you've asked for is going to help you reach that end goal of really hardening your facility. So they do give you a good amount of room to answer that question. Let's see, let's move down. So now let's talk a little bit about milestones. And this is definitely challenging for a lot of my clients this year. They also have experienced a lot of applicants who in the past have received awards, but again, they ask for extension after extension, because once you win the money, it's not just like they cut you a check. There are some grants that will match your budget, and it's a little bit of a different process, but for the NSGP, they want to know exactly what you're spending money on. They're not just going to cut you a check. You have to actually produce the proposals and show them, you know, what products you're installing, answer any questions that they might have. And sometimes they will actually come and visit and audit. I don't have any clients. I think one client that said they received a visit, but so I don't know that they do that very often, but you have to make sure that if you say you're spending money on locks, you're actually installing locks in your facility. You're not using it for something else. So they want to know, how are you setting these milestones? If you're going to be installing locks and cameras, when are you going to start collecting bids? When are you going to start, you know, evaluating different products? When is your project going to kick off in terms of the construction? And then are you able to meet the milestones that we're setting forth in our guidelines? If you can't spend all this money in the 3 years that we're giving you, you have to explain why. We don't want you to come back to us and ask for an extension because you're not organized. You don't have somebody dedicated to spending this grant, right? So they want to make sure you can do that. Mm-hmm.
Is the money issued on a draw, like as you hit those milestones?
So I know that I wouldn't say it's issued on a draw. I believe it's more of like a reimbursement. So you're getting the, and I'll triple check. That's the one thing I don't do, is I don't do the accounting. But the clients that I work with, when we talk to our grant representative, we will show them the quotes that we're receiving from our bidders, and we'll say, here's why we're selecting this specific product. In all of our research, we decided this is the product that we want to go with. This is how much it costs. I often get the MSRP from the manufacturer just to have that documented, that we're doing our research. We're not getting ripped off by the integrator. And then also with the integrator, they have to show that they are in fact charging what they're charging per item. We've gotten some quotes where they give us like a one lump sum. Can't use that. We need to see that breakdown because we have to explain it to our grant rep. And that becomes a challenge, because I've worked with some institutions that had to move off of the incumbent integrator there because they just did not have the ability to break it down by line item. And it's unfortunate, but we can't move forward. We're not going to get our reimbursement unless we can show them that detailed document of, here's what we're spending our money on. Here's how much it costs. We've done our homework. We know what the MSRP is, and we're able to fit this in the budget that you gave us. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's just go back. So those are the milestones. And then of course, on the project management side, this is where you're going to name someone in your organization that's the point of contact for the grant representative to reach out to make sure that they are in fact doing everything they need to do. A lot of people don't realize that when you get the grant award, before you do anything else, you have to publish an ad in the paper announcing your grant award, that you're going to be looking for bids, the type of project, the type of installation that you're going to be doing. That sometimes catches people off guard, but it's a fairly simple item to complete. And then once that's done, then you can start the process of speaking to the different integrators, looking at the different projects or products out there and evaluating what you're going to install. But that person who's managing that process from your organization has to be named in the investment justification. You can also name a third party like myself as a consultant. We're also working with a consulting firm to help us through the process. If you're asking for funds to pay for the management and administration of that grant, that they call that the M&A, it's 5% per NSGP grant. you want to name that person. You want to let them know that, yes, we have somebody that is going to help us with the M&A. And then lastly, the impact. This is, well, in the previous year, there were two main points that they wanted to know under the impact section, which is, how is this project, how are these funds and the project that you're going to spend the funds on, how is it going to impact your organization? How is it going to help you to protect your community, protect your students? You want to paint that picture for them. And then, of course, they want to know, did you receive any funds in previous years? Now, they don't really give you a lot of pointers on how to be more competitive during this process. They try to be like very vague in a lot of their answers. But this year they did mention that if you hadn't received a grant in previous years, you were going to get some extra points. They want to make sure that everyone has a chance to receive funding and help themselves, which is great. And so that covers the investment justification.
So one question that I just had on the project management side, what role is it at the facility that usually ends up being the point person?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Well, so at the school or, at the facility, who is it that is the kind of signs off on owning the grant process?
Again, it's up to your organization. I've seen people where apply enlisting the executive director's name, and quite often the executive director has no time to look at the grant, so they pass it off to their administrator. Sometimes they put their administrator's name on as the point person. So my recommendation is whoever's name you put on there, make sure it's someone who has skin in the game. I've seen a lot of people, again, put an administrator's name on there where they don't have a clue what they're doing. They're so overloaded as it is. And that's the last thing on their lists because it's not burning and urgent for them to pay attention to. You have this 3-year window and they keep pushing it off. And then it starts to pile up and now you have to ask for an extension. So make sure that person is going to be focused, has the ability and the tools and the resources to actually focus on this project. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself asking for an extension. But also equally, if you're getting someone, a third party, if they're not dedicated to your project, same thing. There's really no skin in the game for them, especially if you're paying them and you're paying them up front. They kind of don't care. It's not their facility. Even on the grant writing side, and if anyone has attended the FEMA website or the FEMA webinars, they will tell you that one of the main reasons why they reject applications is because they see a lot of copy and paste. And those tend to come from grant writers who, again, they get paid to help the institution apply for the grant, but there's no skin in the game for them. So they have an abundance of applications they have to get through, and they do a lot of copy and pasting. And then the applicant doesn't know to check themselves and make sure that everything is accurate, and they just allow them to submit. Well, ultimately, you're paying that person. It's still up to you. It's still your responsibility to make sure all the information is accurate. And I am the first person to ask my clients, please check my work. Please double check. You know your facility better than I do. You live in it all day long. Check everything that I've written in here for you. Make sure it's accurate.
Good.
So I'm gonna go back to the slides. Those consulting services is something that a lot of people don't know, and it's not the case for every single grant, but for the NSGP, they will pay for those consulting services, that M&A money. So for this past year, fiscal year 22, they allotted up to $7,500, which is 5% of the grant, for a dedicated person to manage the grant spend, because they recognize it's a lot of work. It's a lot of documentation. It's a lot of back and forth with your grant rep. It's collecting all of the bids and communicating with the bidders, answering their questions, speaking to the manufacturers, making sure that what you're purchasing is in fact allowable under the grant. Because if you sign that purchase order and you spent the money and then the grant rep says, oh, we're not paying for that, it's on you now. So you want to make sure that you have somebody dedicated and the resources to work through this whole process. The great thing is, and I try to leave some encouraging words at the end of this, because, you know, I do want to make sure everyone understands it's a very long, hard, arduous process. But at the end of the day, once you've done 1 or 2 of these grants, especially if you're only working with your facility, it definitely becomes easier. You know, you start to learn the ropes. You can use a lot of information that you had from previous years to sort of rinse and repeat for the next year's application. The NSGP will allow you to use the same assessment 2 years in a row, but you do have to update it if anything in the facility has changed. So if you've asked for funds in fiscal year 21 for cameras, and now you've installed new cameras, well, when you resubmit, you have to make the adjustment in your assessment to say, we've added 10 new cameras. And now we're asking for money for locks. So you want to make sure it's accurate every single year, but you can reuse a lot of the information over and over, and it starts to get easier. And again, I have clients that apply every single year and they win a lot of money. So again, if you have somebody really dedicated to that management and administration process, it becomes easy really, really fast, because they're going to be organized. They're going to keep everything documented, everything in a central file, so that when you have to refer back to it, and that's how we do it anyway. We try to be as organized as we can. So, so that's it. You know, I say to everybody at this point in time, with everything that's going on, can you afford not to do this? If you have plenty of budget and you can accomplish everything you want to do for your security program, God bless you. But if you don't, you need to start going after some of these grants. And I also want to throw out there, I don't charge to review anyone's assessment. I'm not the be all end all, but I've been doing it for a long time, and I can definitely spot certain things or make some recommendations that maybe somebody might have overlooked. So I do that for free. If anybody ever wants to share their assessment with me, I'm happy to take a look at it and give my opinion. Or if anyone has questions, I give a lot of free information out, a lot of free resources, just because I genuinely feel like this is a really important thing to share. I would never charge anyone to just give free resources that they can find online. So if anyone has questions or want to dig into the COPS grant or the NSGP, or even want that state and local list, please email me. I'm happy to share that with you.
Can facilities apply for multiple grants at the same time? So could you get an NSGP grant and a COPS grant to you in the same year?
As long as you qualify for each. So if you're a hospital, you can't apply for the COPS grant because that's specific to schools. But if you're a nonprofit hospital, you can apply for the NSGP. Same thing on the state and local side. I have a lot of schools and houses of worship that apply for the NSGP and the hate crimes grant. So they'll win, 150, depending on how many buildings they apply for. They'll win 150 with the NSGP, but then they'll also win 75,000 with the state and local grant. So yes, you can apply for multiple. And that's why our team of grant experts, they comb through all of the grants that they have, and anytime they see that they're allowed to allocate some of the funds for security purposes, we give our team the heads up. So it might not be a security specific grant, but they'll allow you to spend some money on security related items. Why not? Go after it.
Well, this has been excellent, very informative. I appreciate your time this morning.
No, I appreciate you guys. And I'm also, as we get into grant season, I'll probably be sending some folks your way to get some quotes for locks or anything else. So please stay in touch with me and send me any kind of pricing you have. The pricing is really helpful. Even if it's just MSRP, we're not worried about the discounts right now. We just want to make sure that we have a rough order of magnitude of what people can spend money on. And I also try to help anyone who doesn't win a grant. So a lot of my clients, and even a lot of the work that I do pro bono for, especially if it's school. I can't stand the idea of a school not being able to do this because they didn't have the resources to pay me. So I will do some of this pro bono, but if they don't get the grant, I try to direct them to other solutions, even if it's a secondary security device. I know there's a little controversy sometimes over those, but I'd rather them have some type of solution, and everyone has to decide what's right for their own facility. I can't do that for them. You know, unless they want to hire me to be their security consultant, then I could advise them. But, you know, you have to make the determination of what is the right solution for your organization, for the demographic that you're serving. And if you can't afford, if you don't get the grant and you can't afford some expensive equipment, what else is out there for you? How else can you protect yourself? So, so if you have any other solutions like that, particularly low cost solutions, please share them.
Yep.
Okay.
Well,
Any parting words?
Yeah, Lisa, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your expertise today. This is wonderful. Thanks.
I appreciate it.
yeah.